co-sponsors of tonight's webinar. So a huge thank you goes out to the New Hampshire Network for Energy, Environment, and Climate that will be co-sponsoring with us tonight. And then thank you as well to our corporate sponsors who help us keep this webinar series going, the Nature Conservancy and the Colony Group. Now I'll introduce our moderator of tonight's session, and we invite you to put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and then he will be leading a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So tonight moderating, we have Dr. Reinmar Seidler. He's going to be introducing our speaker as well. He teaches conservation biology, sustainability science, and climate change at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and he serves as a member of the steering committee for the New Hampshire Network. His research focuses on impacts of climate change and other global change on biodiversity and people's livelihoods in the Eastern Himalaya. So Dr. Seidler, I will pass it over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here, joining the Healthcare Workers for Climate Action, one of our partners at the New Hampshire Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. And we have a wonderful presentation, very interesting set of research. And I'll just briefly introduce Dr. Sarah Kelly, and then I'll then turn it over to her. Dr. Sarah Kelly is lecturer in geography at Dartmouth College and also professional manager and co-founder of the Energy Justice Clinic in the Irving Institute of Energy and Society, which is also based at Dartmouth. And I have gotten to know very recently that they have a really interesting program of energy and energy justice in particular, and just recently published in 2023 in the journal Energy Research and Social Science, an article with some familiar names to Granite Staters who are interested in energy, including Julia Griffin, April Salas, and Dawn Crease, and Dr. Kelly. And Dr. Kelly also has a really interesting background. She's got long-standing research project in southern Chile, working with Mapuche indigenous groups on energy justice and distribution in that area. And so very diverse background, and very much looking forward to what she has to say about New Hampshire. Dr. Kelly.
Thanks so much, Dr. Seidler. Thanks so much, Emily, for hosting me. It's really exciting to be with you all tonight. Also, I'm really happy, Emily, that you provided a land acknowledgement. I'm born in New Hampshire. I come from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it's really exciting to see how things have changed in our recognition over time. So without further ado, I'm really excited to be with you all tonight to be talking about the research project that Dr. Seidler mentioned on community choice aggregation and energy justice in New Hampshire. And then I'm going to move into, after talking about that, for about 20 minutes, I'll move into talking about our ongoing research on the energy burden and energy insecurity in the Upper Valley, because they're interrelated, and I think they give a more holistic picture about energy justice concerns in this region. So let's see if my slides are going to agree. So yeah, just a little bit about the Energy Justice Clinic. We founded it in 2021. The lead author on the article that Dr. Seidler mentioned is Professor Maren Greenleaf, who co-founded the clinic with me, and she's an assistant professor in anthropology at Dartmouth College. And the mission of the Energy Justice Clinic is to create a more equitable and accessible energy transition through engaged student learning and meaningful community partnerships. And we really work to study the interconnections between energy systems and people, and do this through community-based participatory research that are guided by local knowledge and interests. And the idea is that that approach helps to make energy systems more just, inclusive, and equitable. And this is just a little model about how we work. So we work with students, faculty, and community, and the types of outcomes that we create are research, articles like the one I'll be talking about tonight, but also community engagement and products. We've painted a mural with the nonprofit Cover Home Repair, and then helping to form our students to be more engaged energy citizens and leaders, but also supporting community partners in their journeys to have more energy autonomy or more participation in different sectors of our energy systems. And just for those who haven't heard much about energy justice before, this is a great image that comes from the Initiative for Energy Justice. I'm just trying to put my picture, there we go, that is about how climate justice, energy justice, and environmental justice are interwoven and overlapping. So I think about how energy justice really helps us to think about how this just transition is affecting marginalized or frontline communities, and how to think about, certain issues like communities being in the floodplains can live with both climate inequity and climate insecurity, but also energy insecurity. So they're really helpful complementary lenses. And these are the 5 pillars of energy justice. I'm not going to go into those in depth, but I'm happy to answer any questions about them. For the paper that I'll be talking about tonight, we drew from the first 3 pillars and analyzed all of our data, which was, I'll talk about that methodology in a minute. But according to these first 3 pillars, which are recognition justice, distributional justice, and procedural justice. And in terms of teaching students, using this type of analytical framework is a really helpful way to think across cases and teach them how to learn to apply kind of analysis to cases and understand what's happening. So yeah, the paper that I was invited to talk about tonight is called Tool for a Just Transition, Community Choice Aggregation and Energy Justice in New Hampshire and Beyond. And this is the list of co-authors. We had some really wonderful community partners who helped make this paper what it is. And then we also had 2 students who were part of the paper, which was really exciting at Dartmouth College undergrads. So yeah, just some basic overviews of community choice aggregation in a national context. And this is, if I don't cite it otherwise, all of this is from our paper, but I do use some additional sources, which I include in the slides. So 30 million people in the US live in jurisdictions where municipalities or related institutions purchase electricity for residents, and 10 states, as of now, have adopted community choice aggregation legislation. So in Massachusetts, oops, there's a misspelling there. There's 68% of residents use CCA power. Local states also include New York. And then California is really an important model and case for community power because of how it's grown throughout the state. And it's been noted for their support of local renewable energy generation, energy efficiency improvements, and energy storage development. So while community choice aggregation in New Hampshire is relatively young, there's hopes that it will lead to these broader benefits in terms of energy efficiency and development of local energy infrastructure in the future. So community choice aggregation can be a strategy both to increase a renewable energy portfolio and or to increase local input and participation in energy decision making. And a critical difference is that CCAs can be opt-in or opt-out. And what that means is basically when you're opt-out, it means that when a town joins, in this case, the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire is the joint aggregation nonprofit that most towns become a part of. When they join it, everybody's automatically placed on that plan, and then they have to opt out, which is quite simple, but that means that there's a much larger customer base that's included off the bat, instead of being opt-in, where you need to work with every individual user to opt in. So a few notes on New Hampshire. Why is New Hampshire an interesting state? Well, you probably all know this already, but there's political diversity. It's a purple state, and community choice aggregation can speak to different users for different reasons, right? It can be attractive in terms of the environmental benefits, but it also can be attractive because oftentimes electricity prices are cheaper for community choice aggregation, and thus far that's been the case in New Hampshire. It's also important because New Hampshire's had a relatively low level of state mandated renewable energy. And New Hampshire has relatively high energy costs and a high percentage of energy burden residents, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the second half of my talk. So yeah, as of the time we published our paper, New Hampshire's renewable portfolio standard was 25.2% by 2025, which is significantly lower than Vermont and other states. And a major difference came in 2019 when the Community Power Act was passed. And that one of the main differences was that previously New Hampshire was opt-in, like I was explaining earlier, and it became opt-out. So that made it a lot easier for local community members and leaders to organize and build out what is now the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire. And currently, and this number keeps changing because towns keep joining, but when I last noted this down, there were 56 members of CPC&H, representing approximately 30% of the state population. And enrolled customers have 4 options. So the town themselves choose what will be the base opt-in, and most have that as granite, although the town of Hanover and a couple other towns bumped that up to granite plus. And then there's clean 50 and that should say clean 100, which is 100%. So those are the 4 options that towns can opt for. And the research that I'm going to be talking about today is based in community-based research methodology. So our research on this began with pictured some members and leaders of Sustainable Hanover Energy Subcommittee. We collaborated with them to learn about community choice aggregation, and they asked us, they were already learning. I mean, one of the exciting things about the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire is that they did a lot of research in how they designed their approach to community power. And so they asked us, Hanover was really involved in this, as was Lebanon early on in getting this started. And Hanover asked us to do some interviews with California CCAs to learn about how they were operating and what were some of the justice and equity concerns that they had come across in the implementation process. So we enjoyed doing that with students and learned a lot from those conversations. And we also regularly attended Hanover's energy subcommittee meetings and CPCNH's online meetings, because they have a lot of their meeting notes and meetings accessible online, which was wonderful as members of the public to join in on. And we learned at these different levels about what were the questions of this new emerging community choice aggregation in New Hampshire. And we also conducted 21 semi-structured interviews and document analysis of 20 documents, including the board meeting notes, to learn about the potential benefits, challenges, and solutions according to these 3 pillars that I mentioned earlier of energy justice. This is an image from Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire, and this demonstrates how they identify the local benefits. So it's about electricity choice, utility partnerships, and innovative services. And one thing I would add here is that, one question, a common question is kind of like, how does this work? Is the utility taken out of the picture? And no, it's not. So the municipalities come together to jointly purchase electricity through the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire, and they purchase from generators, but the utilities are still paid for the distribution and different services. So utilities are still part of this, but they don't provide the electricity generation contracts, so that the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire is able to work in a more flexible way and purchase electricity in shorter time-frames. There's fancier design and decisions that I'm explaining, but those are the basics of this arrangement. And I'd suggest that, if you all are interested in this in the future, inviting someone from the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire to speak more in depth would be great, because they're doing wonderful things and there's a lot of updates and growth from that organization. But a few kind of overviews of our paper and what we found. So we found that there's some real potential benefits of community choice aggregation. In terms of distributive justice, there's reduced energy costs, expanded access to renewable energy, and more stable energy prices. In terms of procedural justice, there's increased local control over electricity and supply. And in terms of recognition of justice, this approach empowers communities to pursue different approaches to accessing electricity. Some challenges that we found is that there can be trade-offs between the cost of electricity and the increase in renewable energy. And that one of the major issues, and we'll see how this plays out over time, is that not all communities have energy committees, right? And energy committees are a key entity to help a town or municipality more quickly join the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire. CPCNH facilitates towns joining and makes it quite straightforward, but there's still a number of steps they need to go through. So the question is, might some towns be left behind because they don't have the resources, human or otherwise, to go through those steps? So there's been a high uptake of towns, and we'll see kind of over time as this becomes a more well-recognized model and it has more stability in a few years, if more towns might join in or what that will look like. But that's a question to follow into the future. And in terms of recognition justice, residents need to live in municipalities and counties with capacity and interest in CCA to join. So if a few members of a town want to join, but the town hasn't joined themselves, that's a barrier for individuals. Potential solutions in terms of distributive justice, there's rate structure, giving choices of energy mixes with different electricity rates and renewable energy content. Those 4 options that I explained to you earlier, Granite, Granite Plus, Clean 50, and Clean 100. Those give options. They don't necessarily sign anyone up for the highest option, which is more expensive and also more green. But individuals have the option to bump up if they can afford it and want to make that commitment. And so it's quite straightforward to do. And that flexibility we found is an equity bonus. In terms of procedural justice, there's support for municipalities with less capacity to consider and pursue CCAs. And in terms of recognition justice, there's the election and appointment of elected representatives to handle CCA-related decision-making. There's a lot of town representation on the executive board of CPCNH, and there's a lot of local input in this process, which is quite impressive. So here's a quote from the paper. CCA's expansion can advance energy justice by increasing access to renewable electricity, reducing and stabilizing electricity costs, and enabling more local control over energy decision-making and infrastructure. In this, CCA positions municipalities at the forefront of the energy transition. The other key set of benefits that we identified is, and kind of the other side to it, is that yet CCA also has a potential to entrench energy injustice. Particularly problematic is its reliance on the capacity of local governments and volunteers to enact it. We argue that this issue can be addressed to some extent through networked aggregation, like that of joint power agencies like CPCNH and potential emergent regional solutions like AVEC. AVEC refers to the Androscoggin Valley Energy Collaborative, which I believe may be shifting in terms of its name, but it's been an effort from communities in North Country along the Androscoggin Valley and River that are trying to jointly organize a number of towns to join and then use some of the funds in the future from CPCNH to support regional economic development, including improving their transmission line, which basically they produce a lot of energy within the region, but have difficulty selling it to the outside market because of the limitations in the existing transmission line. So basically, there's a lot of potential, and there's still kind of support and resources needed to ensure that no one gets left behind on this, and that all towns that want to access this can. So yeah, I won't go too in depth, but this is just the analysis table that we had in our article where we talked about the potential benefits, potential challenges, and potential solutions of community choice aggregation in terms of those 3 pillars. So it's a lot to take in a slide, but I already went over the basics. This just kind of helps to organize all of our findings. And if anybody's interested in receiving this article, feel free to send me an email and I'm happy to share it. So now I'd like to transition to talk a little bit more about our ongoing research with energy insecurity. And basically, as we started to do this research with community partners and our students at Dartmouth College, we were talking to different people, including Don Crease and Angela Zhang from Listen Community Services and other actors throughout the state. And they said, this is great, you're studying community choice aggregation, but really, one of the main energy justice concerns in this region, in this primarily rural, cold region, is the energy burden and how it affects people. So I'm going to talk about both energy insecurity and the energy burden. The energy burden refers to when someone spends over 6% of their income on energy costs. Sometimes it's measured in terms of just housing, heating, electricity, and cooling, and sometimes it's called the total energy burden, where it also includes transportation costs. And energy insecurity refers to when someone lives without the ability or with an instability in being able to cover their energy costs. And often energy insecurity can be overlapping with housing insecurity, with climate insecurity. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, and with food insecurity. So as we think about this just transition to renewable energy, to a decarbonized economy, the idea is that we can also think about ways to build out this systemic change to support those who are most burdened by energy costs in our region. So one of our projects, these are 2 of our students, Ella Brimman and Piper Edwards, with a community partner. John Chaffee from Lebanon Energy Advisory Committee. And this is a co-designed survey that we've done with the Lebanon Energy Advisory Committee and Listen Community Services to try and get better data on the energy burden as it's lived locally. And so we're bringing together a survey that's been designed by a government professor at Dartmouth, Professor Jen Jarrett, with interviews that are more in-depth to get at how people's lived experiences are with energy burdens and with accessing energy savings. And I thought, I brought in this research area because this is a key overlap with health. Energy insecurity relates to health issues, physical health issues, and mental health issues, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there's a few different numbers depending on the report that you look at. There's a really excellent report by the VEIC from Vermont, and they wrote about how the average total energy burden in New Hampshire is 9.2%, but this is uneven across the state. So again, we're looking to the North Country of New Hampshire, to Coos County. And in Coos County, they found in 2017 that the household total energy burden is 33% greater than the New Hampshire average. There's a bit more information from that report above, but they spend at that point an average of $5,730 annually for electricity, heating, and transportation, and have an average energy burden of 14.3%. So as you can see, the energy burden is unevenly distributed throughout the state. And so when we think about community choice aggregation and energy burdens and who might be left behind in both of those areas, the north of New Hampshire is one area where we can see there's an overlap. So there's, when we think about these solutions, ideally we can think about how both of these areas can be addressed. And I would say that there's already great efforts being underdone. Clean Energy New Hampshire has a great circuit rider program. They've been doing lots of energy projects over the years with Coos County, among other counties. So there's already great work being done, but there's more that we can do. This is another report written by the Island Institute about bridging the rural efficiency gap. I like this report. I assign it to my students. It's basically describing the slower uptake of energy efficiency upgrades in isolated communities, even though the higher energy costs make home improvements more cost effective than in areas with low energy prices. So it's another thing about understanding what our region is like and what are the unique challenges. A lot of the energy insecurity literature that we read in my class is based in urban areas. There's amazing work being done in New York City out of Columbia University, Diana Hernandez, among others, leading that. There's great research happening in Michigan. There's some great research happening, but there's less understood about how these dynamics are lived and experienced in our region. So that's what we're interested in contributing to. I guess a few things I point out to this is, the amount of old and dilapidated housing, which is leaky and hard to heat, which is part of why the energy burden can be higher. The amount of homes heated with fuel oil is quite high in this region, and the percentage of population in rural areas. So this is a different number for the energy burden than we saw in the other report. This is earlier and there's a different data source they're drawing, but you can see that there's a variation in numbers on the energy burden. This is the average energy burden and not the total energy burden, which is why there's such a difference between those two numbers. So energy security and energy insecurity is largely ignored or invisible, right? It can be hard to see. It can be hard to understand how people are bearing those burdens and what they're experiencing. And it's largely not been a big topic in scientific literature, although that is changing. The natural gas prices rising due to the war in Ukraine really led to a lot more literature and research on this in Europe, among other places. So while, there hasn't historically been a ton of research on this area, people are in dire situations. They can often be in what's called a heat versus eat dilemma, where they have to choose between heating their home or healthy food, or other difficult issues like getting an operation they need versus paying the electricity bill. So these are really stressful and difficult choices folks need to make. So now I'm going to show a few slides. We did this social media collaboration with the research team of Professor Diana Hernandez at Columbia University, thinking a little bit about the energy insecurity as it's lived in the Upper Valley and in New York City. And this is based on her research primarily. So there's 3 primary dimensions that she documents in very extensive surveys in New York City. and long-term research. And we found that they're really helpful to understanding energy insecurity in this area, although they can be different symptoms. So physical insecurity, like issues with homes, that the windows don't close, that there might be faulty electricity wires, that there's a number of infrastructural issues affecting a home. Economic insecurity, so that people are having difficulty paying those bills. And then coping mechanisms that people adapt in order to live within those situations. And those can often create further health exposures or further risk to homes like fires. And I'll talk about that in a second. So in terms of physical energy insecurity, they're about physical deficiencies in the home environment, such as draft windows, poor insulation, insufficient appliances, and faulty heating and cooling systems. So to give a real quick example, we visited an off-campus apartment unit in Hanover, New Hampshire that Dartmouth undergraduates were living in. And we went with professionals who are doing a blower door test to see where the leaky air was happening. But as we went in, the light switch in the bathroom started sparking. And then we went upstairs to see if they had checked to see if there's any asbestos before they do a blower door test. And they found particulate matter. Of course, they couldn't confirm whether it was asbestos or not, but the whole roof area was not closed off properly. So they couldn't even perform the blower door test to get to know about the energy efficiency or inefficiency of that apartment. So that was a real kind of experiential learning moment for students to kind of see how the physical infrastructure and security overlaps with other issues. Economic energy insecurity refers to the disproportionate share of household income allocated to energy expenses, with those that exceed a 10% threshold categorized as experiencing economic energy insecurity, which would be a higher amount than the US federal energy burden at 6%. And then coping energy insecurity results from economic and or structural facets of energy insecurity. And so extreme energy conservation, seeking fuel assistance, and using improvisational heating alternatives like space heaters and ovens to supply heat. So the health incomes, and forgive me because you all know these more than I do, but I always show these to my students so that they have an idea of the different health incomes. And I'm sure there are actually more, but these are the main ones. That with these conditions, there can be increased moisture. The differential in temperature over days and nights can lead to increased mold and respiratory illnesses like asthma. There can be parental and child stress, anxiety, and depression. And oftentimes, children and elderly are most affected by these health issues because they spend more time in the home. And so that's another additional concern. And there can be fires associated with faulty space heaters or other types of coping mechanisms being employed over longer time frames. And then overall, folks are dealing with this trifecta of insecurity, which is about housing, energy, and food. If people fall behind on their electricity costs in their home and they get into arrears, that can be one of the first steps to becoming unhoused. So these are really interrelated issues. There are different types of energy efficiency interventions. Put a few of them here just to give some examples. This is not exhaustive, but it includes caulking windows, window inserts, and or installing double windows, among other weatherization measures. Replacing boilers is a costly but effective measure. And using blower door tests to document and find out where there are the leaky areas of a home. So this is an example from Diana Hernandez's paper. This is Patrick, who's 31, who lives in a rent stabilized apartment and has unstable work. I have to put on my oven at night because of the heat. The building controls the heat. The heat comes on only a little bit. It's almost like you don't feel anything. It's like freezing cold and I have to turn on my oven, even though I know the oven is not a good thing to turn on. I turn it on at night, like every night. That's why my bill will be so high. When I get up, I feel nauseous. I know they say carbon monoxide. When I wake up, I feel like I'm suffocating. Then I shut it off and deal with the cold for another 4 hours or so. I'd just be depressed after a while. Oh boy, here we go again. Another turn-off notice. A little down or depressed. Anxious to see how I'm going to pay it. So I included this because I feel like it really does show how these different factors come together in a lived experience. Like I said, in our study, we haven't done these interviews yet, but I anticipate there'll be similar experiences and also different experiences that we learn about, because in New York, there are different issues with apartment buildings and people not controlling their heat, whereas people living in other forms of housing like mobile homes, manufactured homes, or large dilapidated housing might have other issues that they're facing. And this is a national issue. It's not just pertinent to our region, but because we are such a cold region that's dependent on oil among other, and propane to heat among other heating sources, it does hit us more. There's one scholar, Professor Tony Reams, who is now at the Department of Energy. He's a professor at University of Michigan normally, but he's working right now at the Department of Energy, and he calls us the United States of Energy and Security, to reference what a large scale and widespread problem this is. So with that, I'd love to open us for questions. My students and I share out our research on Instagram. We also have a website, but our most up-to-date stuff is on Instagram, so feel free to check us out. And I'd be very happy, we would like to expand this energy and security and energy burden research. And I've had some early conversations with folks at Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, but it does seem like health workers really have an excellent way of accessing and understanding communities and marginalized communities in different areas. And so interested in exploring partnerships to expand our research on the energy burden in other parts of New Hampshire. So thanks so much, and I look forward to hearing questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kelly. This is awesome. Very interesting stuff. There aren't very many questions yet, and I encourage folks um, to put some into the chat, because it's really always good to know what people are wondering about. I would actually like to start off, Dr. Kelly, with just a quick question, and I wonder whether you could explain a little bit more detail about the three justice pillars that you talked about at the beginning, because I think it's really important that people keep in mind that energy justice is a multi-dimensional thing, and it'd be nice to get those different perspectives. I know there are actually 5 pillars that you mentioned, but 3 of them were dealt with specifically in this research.
Sure. Let me see if I can share my screen again to have an accompanying slide while I talk about it. One second while I pull it up. I'm going to go back to the pillars at the beginning because I think that's the easiest way. So most of the energy justice research started out being about distributional justice, which refers to the equitable allocation of benefits and burdens from energy development. So like a case might be that one community bears the burden of a hydropower project, a hydroelectric power project, and they've lost access to certain farmlands, or they've been affected by flooding in different ways. But if they don't receive those local benefits, then that would be a kind of classic case of a distributional injustice, where they're bearing most of the burden, but not receiving the majority of the benefits. So that's a simplified case, but that's kind of one of the main pillars that first started with a lot of the energy justice research. In the clinic, we find that we focus a lot on procedural justice, which is about fair access to a process. So it can be about participation, like, is everybody able to make these events when people are planning community choice aggregation? Are the meetings during the day, or are they in the evening? Are the meetings being held in English, or are they available if it's an area where there's a lot of Spanish speakers or another language? Is there a way that that's also accessible to other language speakers? Things like that. Do people have a Zoom option for people who might have a high energy burden and can't afford the transportation costs to get to a meeting regularly? So it looks different in every case, but procedural justice is a really important pillar. And then recognition, these are all interrelated, but recognition justice is about grasping and acknowledging different types of vulnerabilities and needs. So it can be about, it's really about recognizing the needs within communities and the challenges they might be facing and including those within a process. So those are the three main pillars. Sometimes it can vary, but restorative justice is about addressing issues of past harm incurred by energy decision making. So one example would be out west, there was a lot of uranium mining that was done, and there's long-term environmental and health impacts from that. And when in the Navajo Nation, among other local communities, and so when there are new energy proposals, people are distrusting or need for a restorative justice of those past harms before there can be a good faith development of new options in many cases. And epistemological justice is actually a pillar that we've really worked on with our students. Like Dr. Seidler mentioned, I do a lot of work in Chile, and one of the cases that we work on is with Mapuche-Williche communities. And there, a lot of the procedural justice issues are about recognizing different ways of knowing the world. So different ways of knowing waterways, different relationships to water. And so my students and I really thought a lot about epistemological justice needing to be another pillar. But that it can also make sense to think about it in New Hampshire. It could be about along class lines or along different types of difference and making sure that different knowledge forms are recognized and included in these processes. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful, and happy if there's any further clarification needed there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. And I think we've got a an interesting question from Susan Richmond. Do you want to speak up, Susan? Are you there? Let's see. Yes.
Okay, actually, I think looks like Paul Frederick asked the same question, which is
Oh,
how to reconcile people wanting to have less expensive energy versus hoping that people choose to have more renewable energy. And I think, Dr. Kelly, that you were kind of inferred that there were incentives that people were attempting to perhaps encourage more renewable or make it possible. So could you just speak to that in general?
Sure. Yeah. And I also was reading it. Thanks, Tad, for clarifying. The Clean 100 is 100% renewable energy, as I understand it too. So thus far, the great thing about community choice aggregation in New Hampshire is that the base option has a higher amount of renewable energy than utilities typically offer, and it's more affordable. So there's no need at the base option for communities to choose between one or the other, right? They're able to have a higher amount of renewable energy than they could from their other utility options and have it at a more affordable price. Now, the question there is what might happen over time. So we'll see. But it seems to me, based on interviews and observation, like there's a lot of intelligent design that's been done by CPCNH to be able to have a bit of a buffer to support the costs remaining low. And because of that flexibility that I talked about. Now, if folks want to opt up into Granite Plus or the Clean 50 or Clean 100, the higher percentages of renewable energy, then it becomes more expensive. So those are personal choices that folks make. And I know that Clean Energy New Hampshire and other groups had been working on different campaigns to kind of support people in making those decisions if they can afford them. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, Susan, but there's
no economic,
no what?
it's not an economic encouragement, it's just a sort of an ethical one.
If they want to do a much higher percentage, yeah.
That's great. Carolyn Gephardt has a question also about the opt-out system, and she says, with the CCA, the opt-out aspect, is that each town opting in or out, or do individuals within each town opt out? And if the latter, where do they get their energy from?
The individuals opt out, and they'd opt back to purchasing from a utility. There's, in New Hampshire, there's other options with third-party providers. There's kind of a wide variety of options, but the traditional ones are the big utilities. and they choose as any consumer would.
And does there have to be a minimum percentage of people opting in that case for it to make sense? What if you have a large, like a majority of people opting out in a town?
That's a great question. I haven't heard of that. I don't think any town is in the position, and as I understand it thus far, it's like if it doesn't have the support to get if it gets support to get passed in the town, there's typically
Hmm.
enough of a base to purchase. But I don't know. I haven't heard. I don't know the fine print, and I haven't heard of a case where that's happened. But that'd be one I'd follow up and look into for you all because I'm not sure the specific answer of that one.
And
Yeah.
hi, this is Patsy. I'd like to add just one thing. If you live in a county, Cheshire County or Merrimack County, in a town that hasn't chosen community power, you can, as an individual, choose to opt in. And I know there's people, for example, in Ringe that have kind of got their neighbors to go in. So even if there's just a few people in a town, if you're in a county that has community power aggregation, it's available to you.
Thanks,
But
Kathy.
there are just a few counties of which that's the case, right?
Right now,
Just two, yeah.
but I'm sure others will come online. So yeah, it's Merrimack County and Cheshire County.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And I see Tad's question, have we talked with CPCNH about our proposed possible solutions? Yes, and one of the to-dos that we want to do now is to be in touch about our survey and see if there might be an interest among different towns to use our energy burden survey or to support them in thinking more about energy efficiency. That being said, I know that, I heard a presentation, Brian Calnan is the CEO, and if folks are really interested in CPCNH, he might be a next person to try and invite to learn more in depth about this because there's a lot, it's very dynamic and there's a lot happening there kind of day to day. And we did a lot of research on it, but haven't been as active in the last 6 months or so. But yeah, they've hired a bunch of new staff. So I imagine that I know that they've had energy efficiency on their on their to-do. I guess I'd give one more. The way it happened in California and to some extent Massachusetts is, they build up their reserve funds over time as the organization grows. And then there's more possibility to run energy efficiency programs and or to support energy storage or other local energy infrastructure needs. So it's both through the reserve funds that they develop and as they get a certain amount of money moving through, I might be oversimplifying this, but they're able to access municipal bonds, which allows for bigger infrastructural projects. So as CPCNH, it's only been operating for about under 2 years. And so as they get more years under their belt and grow, they'll be able to do more projects. And so, stay tuned and follow what they're doing. It's pretty exciting.
Hmm.
Are community solar projects the next step for CCAs? Not necessarily. And again, that'd be an interesting question to ask them now, but community solar it's a different, it's a slightly different mechanism that can be complementary. They may end up supporting some community solar, but I haven't heard about that on their horizon. So that's a good question, but it's a slightly different model.
I have a question about well, we have a number of people from Massachusetts, residents from Massachusetts on the in the audience, and so I'm curious. I mean, you did mention that Massachusetts has, well, almost 70% of residents have CCA power. That's pretty impressive. Um, could you talk a little bit about the differential sort of or the variation in the history of CCA in different states within New England? I mean, New Hampshire is a topic that comes up a lot. New Hampshire is sort of an exception within New England as a whole, and we're surrounded by Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts that have probably very different histories and maybe longer histories of embarking on this attempt to broaden CCA a little bit. How much would you be able to talk to that question?
So I just I just pasted an article link in the chat, which is an article that we really relied on to kind of have a first understanding of Massachusetts CCAs as they evolved. And it's excellent. It's written by Dr. David Hsu at MIT. And it's a really good kind of historical policy piece. And the main difference is that in Massachusetts, each of the CCAs are different. They're all slightly different. And a lot of folks cite and look to it's the Cape Cod's CCA that had a lot of energy efficiency involved. Whereas New Hampshire, I think because it's a smaller state and because of the research they did at looking at Massachusetts, talking to folks there in California, they made this one joint powers authority agency. Now, like Kathy said, there are some other towns and regions that have taken different options and worked through brokers, which you could see in that first map that was on my slides. But the majority of the towns in New Hampshire are working through one CCA entity, which is different than Massachusetts.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'd recommend that article is a great source, and it's a nice read in terms of sometimes academic articles can be a little dry, and this one's good.
Yeah, great, thanks. There's a question about bringing this back to healthcare workers for climate
Mhm.
action. Is there a move for healthcare workers to partner with programs already working in New Hampshire, such as Clean Energy NH, or AVEC, or CPCNH? I ask because demand reductions, building insulation, air sealing, more efficient appliances, etc., to reduce energy supply needs is critical to reduce energy costs.
That's such a great question, Kate. And I don't know of any specific instances that I could point you to, but I hope so. And you know, in our position at the Energy Justice Clinic, we certainly would like to help support those exchanges. I did see Tad, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you know of any instances via your work in Lebanon and the groups you know of interaction between those groups?
I have not heard of any, but it's a great idea.
Yeah, those are the types of coalitions that when you all invited me, I was like, oh, I hope this starts us thinking about this. And I'm sure others are thinking about it. And my apologies if I'm unaware of any efforts that are ongoing. Clean Energy New Hampshire seems to be doing a lot in the energy space in New Hampshire. And I always kind of look back at their website and I'm like, oh, they're doing something else now. So I would look at them again, but I think there's a lot of potential for this. You know, the energy burden survey we're doing with Lebanon Energy Advisory Committee and others is because they're trying to apply for some Inflation Reduction Act funds and other funds, and they were finding that they didn't have all the data they needed to write compelling grants. And so one of the grants they put in recently was to make a low-income heat pump program. And so you know, that's our project has kind of been at that intersection about supporting those conversations, but I think there's a lot more we could do. So yeah, Kate, if you have any ideas, please let me know. I see Tad as a hand up.
If I can just jump in, because the question asked about whether our organization, New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action, is doing anything in particular with Clean Energy New Hampshire or Community Power of New Hampshire. We certainly advocate for this energy efficiency. Our organization is primarily an educational one, though, reaching out to healthcare providers, communities, the public in general, with education about the facts about climate change and health challenges in New Hampshire, to bring it home, bring climate change home to New Hampshire residents, as it were. But we've participated in things like the new priority climate action plan of the state of New Hampshire through the Department of Environmental Services. And we're advocating in our one-on-one meetings with them for more funds for insulation, weatherization, and what have you. And that ended up being built into their priority climate action plan, which was great to see. You know, we've all felt that New Hampshire Saves has been underfunded in large part because of the way the PUC interprets the benefits of that expenditure on weatherization. But DES did incorporate that. I don't know where they are in terms of looking for IRA funding for that more in the state, but I know it was an interest in their climate action plan. And to their credit, they also recognize the challenge of pre-weatherization preparations, as you, Sarah, pointed out so well with that study, the example of the house that they went into trying to do a blow test. They couldn't even do a blow test. They couldn't even get to weatherization because they were dealing with housing challenges of pre-weatherization. So they did pick up on that reality. So hopefully somebody at the state level is working on finding funds for that. We certainly are behind that. We don't have the influence to make it happen, but we certainly advocate for it.
Great. Looks like Tad's got a hand up.
Two thoughts. One, an idea that this healthcare workers group could act as an advocacy organ to get your member communities to join CPC&H if you haven't already. Just that kind of catalyst can go a long way towards getting that to happen. My second thought is with regard to the question around community solar. That term means different things to different people. What we in Lebanon are doing very actively is working with the legislation, it's pending, and the Public Utilities Commission to boost the ability for our town to work with CPC&H to build large solar arrays to supply our town and drop the cost of energy down to where it's lower. Renewable energy costs less than the default energy service. So we are actively working with CPC&H on that now.
That's a great update, Tad. I put in a couple more resources looking at the questions folks had in the chat. Lois, I haven't seen any data reported by CPC&H about the demographics, but I did put in a list of the EJ communities in that NPR report that were included. So I think Berlin is recently signing on to CPC&H, if I'm not wrong. I heard that. And I'm not sure about the other towns, but that'd be the list to check. And Nashua has signed on. Doria Brown, who's energy manager at Nashua, is also on the board of directors of CPC&H. And then there's one of my favorite organizations that is the resident Rock, New Hampshire. And they're doing really interesting community solar work. That work started with Vermont Law and Graduate School as well. And they, mobile home communities, manufactured home communities are one of the types of infrastructure and communities that are vulnerable not only to energy insecurity, but also to climate insecurity, because oftentimes they can be built in floodplains, also kind of additional costs. And so Rock, New Hampshire helps mobile home communities purchase the land collectively underneath them, and then supports building out community solar projects. And this is in relation to the the Solar for All grant, big announcement from the Biden regime, and a portion of those funds will be administered via the New Hampshire state and also Rock, New Hampshire to build out community solar. So that's another case to like a good news item and something to look as the time goes forward and those funds come through.
Great.
Thank
Other
you.
questions, folks? Don't be shy. If
Sarah,
you have that question in your mind, that means other people do too. Go ahead, Lois.
I was asking specifically in relation to Manchester, where I live, because I'm hoping with others, there's a group of us trying to get a community power established here. I was hoping for evidence of savings. It always moves the needle in Manchester. Among the communities who have been engaged in CPC&H for a while now. That's all, but it will show up somewhere. But thank you very much.
Sure. I know I've heard about Manchester moving through this process, but I'd have to look it up myself to tell you where Manchester's at right now, Lois. Happy if you want to send me an email to follow up on that.
Thank you.
I have a question that's sort of a very broad one. I'm wondering whether you, based on your research and perspectives, whether you feel that this is, I mean, would you describe this CCA as a step toward a less centralized energy distribution system in general? And is it a pretty big step? How would you describe it, characterize it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we do talk about this in our article. I think it is an important step, but we don't know what it's going to be in New Hampshire yet, right? Like it's certainly decentralized decision making. And whether and to the extent to which it's going to decentralize infrastructure is yet to be seen. But from what I've heard and seen of CPCNH, that's certainly the vision. And so, it's one of those things I don't want to say it's a big step in infrastructure decentralization because we're not there yet, but that seems to be the path we're on. And I think it's just, it's not the silver bullet, like no legislation is, but it's been the step that's really catalyzed renewable energy use in New Hampshire and participation. One thing we see a lot with students is that, there's a high level of climate anxiety among our youth, right? I'm sure you see that too. And just getting involved in your local energy system and your community, showing up to these meetings, you see that like we do have the power to make change and to shift how our energy systems are being operated. So to the extent that CPCNH and this movement just gets more people involved, like that's what I've seen in the Upper Valley is we're just, and I'm from Portsmouth, I see it happening in Portsmouth too. When I go back, it's just people are getting through this mechanism, people are getting more involved, and that can lead to many different types of outcomes. So I do think it's going to be a big step for New Hampshire. And, we'll see. Hopefully there's other legislation that continues to make other changes to make this a more just and equitable transition that really includes all communities. I'd say that anyone interested, like there's really interesting research and projects happening with like heat pumps and distributed heating in communities. I've heard about Efficiency Maine is doing some really interesting research and reports on using heat pumps in new ways. And I've seen it in Vermont. There's a geothermal network, and at the Renewable Energy Vermont conference, there's a lot of talk about that. So I think there's a lot of hope and possibility in heat pumps and like kind of these different designed heating systems and rethinking that's happening right now. And so if these things converge, which they surely will, there's going to be bigger transformations.
Yeah, and you started out at the very beginning characterizing New Hampshire as a politically diverse, which I thought was kind of a nice way of putting it. How do you think that changes and alters, or even sort of demands a different approach from, say, our neighbors to the south or to the west?
Well, I mean, I think we're very town focused, right? In terms of our politics, it's local politics that matter. Not to, I mean, you could say that about New England, but I think that's particularly true of New Hampshire. So each town has its own world of politics. And so I think that's an interesting piece. It's interesting to see that there's different groups that are getting behind this for different reasons, right? And I think that's for some money talks, and for some the environmental benefits and the possibility of participation is more important. So that's exciting that it speaks to different groups, makes for a bigger coalition of people behind it. Um, you know, I don't think this only stands true for the North Country, but there are certain, I've heard multiple people talk about it this way in terms of like communities further north. They're not going to change right away. They want to see to like a new thing, right? They want to see how it works. They want to see that it's beneficial over time, not just for a short amount of time. And so, I don't know how it might compare to Massachusetts, for example, or others, but I do think in New Hampshire, there's a lot of communities that might wait a few more years and then jump on. So, what happens with price in electricity over time is really important to that. And yeah, there might be a larger amount of customers in New Hampshire and CPCNH, like a significantly higher number in the future. But we'll see. There could be factors in the middle that change the outcomes.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. This has been really interesting, and I wish you had more time, actually, but we have reached our our limit. Emily, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap up, just to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much to both you, Dr. Seidler, and you, Dr. Kelly, for an amazing presentation, an amazing and really interactive Q&A session. Thank you for sharing your email. I put that in the chat, so if folks have questions, Dr. Kelly is accessible that way. I will send the recording out to you all in case you want to go back and review, as well as the folks who weren't able to make it tonight. So thank you all so much again for being here. Thank you to the New Hampshire Network for all of your support, and I appreciate all of your time. Hope to see you at a future webinar.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you,
Take
Emily.
care, everyone.
Have
Take
a great
care.
night.
Have a good night.